She was just another one of those who go unnoticed. Ruth Malden grew up in a forgotten neighborhood, became a single mom at 17, and ended up as a cleaning lady for a millionaire family who treated her like she didn't even exist. She endured daily humiliation, swallowed her pride, all because of a secret she carried deep in her chest, a son with a rare disease and a fierce will to live. But everything changed the day she saw the keys to the Ferrari left on the front seat. What she did next shocked an entire city and made headlines across the country. What no one expected was what came after that. Subscribe to the channel to hear the real story behind the scandal. No one is born ready to be ignored. But Ruth Malden learned early on that her place in the world was silence. Daughter of an exhausted seamstress and a truck driver who never came back home, she grew up in Clearwood, a place so forgotten even the GPS gave up. The streets had more potholes than trees, and the school, well, it felt more like a warehouse for kids than a place for dreams. But Ruth still dreamed. Even without fancy toys, even with shoes full of holes, she would tell her mom, "One day, I'll make you proud." She just didn't know how brutal that path would be. At 17, the first big blow came: Zion, a beautiful baby boy with the brightest eyes she had ever seen, but a diagnosis that could freeze any heart: congenital myelodysplasia. Ruth was left alone. The baby's father vanished like smoke. Friends? Gone. All that remained was her, and a courage she never knew she had. She started as a fast food cashier, then became a kitchen helper at a nursing home, and finally, a cleaning lady at the Wexler mansion. It was far exhausting, and the bosses treated her like furniture. But they paid on time, and that was enough, or at least she pretended it was. The Wexler mansion looked like something out of a TV show. Glass doors that never opened for her, velvet couches she couldn't sit on, elevators she didn't dare to use. Ruth scrubbed bathrooms that were worth more than her entire house. At first, she tried to smile, but those smiles faded every time Miss Lacey Wexler said, "Oh, Ruth, be careful not to leave smudges on the mirrors." That's crystal, you know. It was a daily humiliation, the kind that slowly eats you from the inside. But Ruth never snapped back. She just lowered her head and said, "Yes, ma'am." A muffled yes, heavy with sadness. She knew every corner of that house. The schedules, the codes, the secrets that slipped through half-closed doors. She heard more than she was supposed to. She knew, for example, that Mr. Bradley Wexler hid cash in wine boxes down in the cellar, and that his wife took pills in secret. It was a house full of luxury and cracks. But no one ever noticed Ruth. It was like she wore an invisibility cloak, a cloak that weighed heavy and hurt. No matter how spotless she cleaned, it was never good enough. Not even a genuine thank you. Just orders, commands, one after another. But Ruth had a strength no one could see. She was the kind of woman who skipped her own medication to afford her son's, who gave up lunch to make sure Zion had dinner, who walked miles when she didn't have bus fare. And she did it all quietly, all with dignity. The world didn't know it, but she was made of steel. Steel wrapped in a blue uniform, with the name Malden stitched across her chest, a cruel reminder that she didn't belong there. And even when she did everything right, she still heard, "Ruth, make sure you do a better job this time." Sundays were her only relief. She'd sit on the porch with Zion, tell made-up stories, draw on the ground with sidewalk chalk, and pretend the world was fair. "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to be a scientist. I'll find my own cure," the boy would say. Ruth smiled, but inside she cried, because the meds were getting more expensive and the symptoms more intense. The illness didn't wait, and the public health care line felt like a cruel joke. Still, she kept going, every single day, without complaining, because mothers don't quit, and she was a mother before anything else. The Wexlers, cold-blooded millionaires, didn't even know Ruth's full name. They called her the cleaning lady, sometimes just the help, as if saying the name of the person who cleaned their hallways was beneath them. But Ruth knew every single one of them. She knew about the cheating, the lies, the secrets swept under the Persian rug. And even so, she never told a soul. She never exposed them. She carried that secret of silent coexistence like a weight on her back. She was the invisible witness of an arrogant play, where she was the only one who seemed to remember that life can turn upside down in a blink. And it did. It all started on a Friday, with weak sunshine. Ruth already had a headache and was wearing worn-out shoes when her phone buzzed. A call from a school. Her heart jumped. "Ms. Malden? It's about your son." The phrase no parent ever wants to hear. Time stopped. The world blurred. Ruth couldn't feel her legs. A wave of fear ran down her spine. Zion had collapsed, and he needed surgery. Urgently. At a hospital 40 minutes away. She dropped her broom right there and ran through the halls. She always walked quietly. But that day, something felt different. From the iron gate to the parking lot, Ruth felt like everything was out of place. The security guard stared at her, puzzled, as if she didn't belong there. Running, crying, panicked. She yelled, begged, pleaded for help. No one moved. The driver chuckled, thinking it was some kind of overreaction. And then she saw it, the Ferrari. The same one Mr. Wexler bragged about on social media, like it was a trophy. Just sitting there, unlocked, the key on the seat. And that's when Ruth knew, sometimes life doesn't give you a choice. She looked at the car, then at the cold eyes of the security guards. The world felt frozen. The only thing moving was her heart, pounding so hard it might burst through her chest. Ruth knew this could cost her everything. Her job, her freedom, whatever shred of dignity she had left. But she also knew something else. Children can't wait. And she wasn't going to let her son die, even if it meant doing the unthinkable. Because some mothers carry a secret. They'll do anything, absolutely anything, for love. The phone slipped from Ruth's hand before she could fully process the call. It had been short but crushing. "Your son had a seizure. He's unconscious. Needs to be transferred. Now." The floor vanished. Ruth got dizzy, cold sweat crawling down her spine, and for a second, she thought she might faint too. But she couldn't. She had to act. She stumbled through the mansion like she was being shoved by her own panic. "Excuse me, I need to leave." "It's an emergency," she cried to the butler, who looked at her like she was a broken piece of furniture. Ruth didn't wait for an answer. She ran down the hallway like the house belonged to her, through the kitchen, the back garden, past the service entrance, until she reached the parking lot. No uniform. Sweating. Barefoot. The pain in her feet was real, but nothing compared to the fear spreading like poison. The driver stood there with arms crossed, scrolling on his phone. Ruth begged, "Please, take me to St. George's Hospital. It's an emergency." He raised his eyebrows and replied with a sneer, "I only drive the family." That was the first humiliation of the day, and the cruelest. Her child's life on the line, and nothing. She tried calling Bradley Wexler. It rang, went to voicemail. Tried his wife's number. Nothing. They were both vacationing in Aspen, posting photos of wine glasses and snowy mountains on Instagram. Enjoying the life I'll never have, Ruth thought, her eyes blurry with tears. Then she tried the security guards. One pretended not to hear. The other laughed. "Are you crazy, Ruth? Take the bus." And that's when it hit her. No one, absolutely no one, cared about her. In that world of luxury, her pain wasn't even worth the effort of a ride. She was alone. Again, desperation began to morph into rage. A hot, quiet, desperate kind of rage. And in that state, she saw the car. A red Ferrari, shining like it had just been polished 5 minutes ago. Parked in a shade. And the key was inside. Did Mr. Wexler forget it? Or was it God who left it there? She wondered, eyes locked on the steering wheel. Was it an invitation? A test? Or just a chance? She hesitated. Her conscience screamed, "You'll go to jail." But her heart whispered, "Zion needs you. Now." And that whisper was louder than any fear. She opened the door with trembling hands. The leather seat burned her sweaty skin. She sat down and took a deep breath. "Ruth, you've lost your mind," she muttered. But the start button was blinking like a lighthouse. The engine roared to life with a metallic growl, almost like a warning. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with sweat, fear, and a kind of courage she didn't even know she had. In the rearview mirror, she saw 2 security guards pointing. "She's stealing the car," one shouted. And there she was, a poor cleaning lady, flooring a millionaire's Ferrari, not knowing if she'd reach the hospital or land in jail. The city wasn't ready for that image. A black woman, desperate, behind the wheel of a car worth over $500,000. Soon, radio alerts started buzzing. Police were called. Security cameras caught everything. Social media exploded. Runaway maid. Crazy woman on the loose. Who does she think she is? The judgment came fast, as always. Without knowing her reasons. Without knowing the secret she carried in her chest. People love a headline more than the truth. And Ruth, invisible all her life, was now seen too much, but for all the wrong reasons. She didn't know how to drive well, let alone a beast like that. The car had a mind of its own. It jumped with the slightest tap, glided like lightning. Ruth hit the wrong buttons, turned on the wipers by mistake. The horn blared, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. On the passenger seat, a bag of cleaning rags fell to the floor. It felt like her old life was being tossed around, sweaty, shaken, disrespected. And in the glove box, a photo of the Wexler's daughter. Irony. That girl's life, framed in gold. Her own son's, hanging by a thread. She sped down unfamiliar streets, blew through red lights, flew past toll booths. The sky turned grayer, and then the sirens began howling behind her. Helicopters appeared. Police cars blocked intersections. "You're going to die, Ruth," she thought. But fear had become a background noise. At every corner, her heart screamed, "Stop that woman. She's just a cleaning lady." It felt like the whole world was closing in on her. But the world didn't know her secret. No one is braver than a mother. And courage, that day, was the only fuel she had left. At the last light before the hospital, a child darted across the street. Ruth slammed on the brakes. The car spun out. People screamed. Horns. Shouting. One security guard reached for his gun. But she didn't stop. "Save my son," she yelled at the doctors rushing out of the ER. She tossed the key onto the counter and collapsed to her knees. Sweat mixed with blood from a cut on her arm. She fainted right there, on the cold floor. Alone. Humiliated. But with a clean conscience, because she'd done what no one else had the guts to do. And there, in the middle of the chaos, the world began to understand who Ruth Malden really was. Ruth had never driven an automatic car. She barely knew how to start a regular one, let alone a Ferrari. But in that moment, all she needed was to get it moving. And fast. Her hands trembled on the wheel. Her heart pounded so loud it echoed inside her chest. The engine's roar mocked her, as if saying, "You don't belong here." Still, she pressed the pedal. The machine answered like a wild beast. The poor cleaning lady had become, unknowingly, the lead actress in the most absurd scene of her own life. And yet, there was no turning back. Traffic was a war zone. Honking, slamming brakes, people yelling out windows. Ruth swerved as best she could, nearly closing her eyes at every intersection. "You're going to kill someone," one driver screamed. But she didn't hear them. It was all just noise. What echoed in her head was the doctor's voice on the phone. "He's critical. Get him here now." So that's what she did. With sweaty hands and eyes filled with tears, Ruth drove that Ferrari like she was in a movie. But this wasn't fiction. This was life. And the price of failure was death. A death she refused to accept. Police were alerted in under 4 minutes. The radio alert was blunt. Black female, dressed as a cleaner, driving a luxury vehicle. Suspected theft. The description, rushed and ruthless, spread like wildfire. No one cared about the why. No one asked what pushed her to that point. All they wanted was the scandal, the label, the headline. And on social media, the comments exploded. Another one trying to be clever. Stealing a rich guy's car? What did she think would happen? People judged without knowing. Without knowing the secret burning in her chest like a scream stuck for years. Helicopters began to follow her. The shadow hovering over the car felt like the warning of a coming tragedy. Ruth shrank into herself, but didn't stop. "Mom, please save me." That's all she could hear in her head. As if Zion were right there beside her, whispering with the weak voice of someone who's already suffered too much. A memory flashed. The day he asked if he was going to die. Ruth had hidden her tears with a smile and said, "Not as long as I'm breathing." Now, she was keeping that promise. even if it cost her everything, even her freedom. Each curve hit like a punch to the gut. The car skidded, but Ruth clung to the wheel like it was her lifeline. With every mile, more sirens, more police cars, more cameras, chaos, a full-blown spectacle. And in the middle of it, a once invisible woman turned into a headline. The humiliation of being chased like a criminal, even while trying to save a life, felt like the cruelest punishment. But Ruth no longer felt shame. She felt urgency. She felt bravery. She felt something that had been asleep for far too long. Fury. The fury of someone silenced all her life. The fury of someone finally breaking free. At an intersection, a police officer motioned for her to stop. She hit the brakes, hesitated. Her hand instinctively reached for the gear shift. But then she heard something. It was the police radio inside the patrol car. An ambulance was called, but it's far. Ruth looked at the dashboard clock. Minutes. Zion didn't have minutes. He had seconds. That's when she hit the gas again, and the Ferrari roared. A fierce, metallic scream that left everyone behind. $1 million car racing through city streets. And behind the wheel, a woman with a secret only love could explain. The hospital entrance appeared on the horizon like an oasis. Ruth flew through the crosswalk without slowing down. A nurse screamed. A cop drew his weapon. A security guard tried to block her. But none of it mattered. She jerked the wheel, slammed the car into the curb, and brought it to a stop with a jolt that nearly snapped her neck. She jumped out, barefoot, bleeding, with her uniform torn and eyes on fire. "Save my son," she screamed to anyone who would listen. And right there, on the sidewalk, Ruth dropped to her knees, like she was handing back to the world something it had always denied her, the right to be heard. The Ferrari key slipped from her hands. Her whole body trembled. Doctors ran. Nurses shouted for a gurney. Police surrounded the area. And as she was wheeled inside, Zion in another medic's arms, the world seemed to stop. For a moment, there was silence. No sirens. No honking. Just the sound of her own heartbeat. Ruth was unconscious. But in that moment, she stopped being an invisible cleaning lady. She had become something no one ever expected. A symbol. A woman who, without knowing it, was about to teach an entire city a lesson it would never forget. Hours later, Ruth woke up on a hospital bed, in handcuffs, a police officer beside her. The nurse whispered, "Your son is in surgery." He made it in time. Ruth closed her eyes, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. There was no relief. Not yet. But there was something she hadn't felt in years, presence. Finally, someone spoke to her like a human being. And even there, lying down, injured, humiliated, she knew she had done the right thing. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about what love demands. And love sometimes demands the unthinkable. What she didn't know was that the real shock was still to come. The next morning, the city woke up to a media explosion. Every news outlet said the same thing. Cleaning lady steals Ferrari in Emerald Heights. Helicopter footage showed the chase like an action movie. Websites posted photos of Ruth collapsed on the sidewalk, on her knees, like a captured criminal. No one told the reason why. No one mentioned the desperate call from the school. Just cold, sharp, cruel headlines. Black woman pulls off bold theft. Trusted employee betrays millionaire family. Ruth became a headline, but the worst kind. Judged without a voice. Stoned without even knowing she was being watched. At the Wexler mansion, Bradley woke up annoyed by the phone ringing nonstop. "What is it now?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. When he read the message from security, his first reaction was mocking. Ruth? The cleaning lady? She stole what? He thought it was a joke. But when he turned on the TV and saw his Ferrari all over the news, his smirk vanished. His wife began to cry. "Oh my God, what if she touched our things?" Their daughter, Lacey, laughed with scorn. "I always said she was weird." And not one of them, not even for a second, considered that maybe there was a reason. Bradley chartered a private jet and flew straight from Aspen to the hospital. He arrived in a suit, dark glasses, and with private security. He was the wounded millionaire, the victim, walking like a lord, outraged by a cleaning lady's audacity. He demanded to see Ruth immediately, but the hospital's legal team blocked him. He was taken to a room where a police officer explained, "Ms. Malden says she did it to save her son's life. We have footage." Bradley insisted on seeing it, and what he saw changed everything. The mansion's security cameras showed Ruth kneeling beside the car, praying before driving away. It was a gut punch. He paused the video, rewound, turned up the volume. Her crying echoed through the empty garage, a silent plea for forgiveness. A whisper to God, "God, protect me. I just want to save my son." Bradley stood frozen. For the first time, he saw Ruth as a human being, not as the cleaning lady. A heavy silence filled the room. The lawyer cleared his throat. The police assistant bit her lip, and the millionaire lowered his shoulders. That image wasn't of a criminal. It was of a desperate mother, and his pride began to crack. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd was growing. Journalists, activists, onlookers. Racial justice groups mobilized fast. Posters appeared with phrases like, "Her son's life matters." The scandal stopped being about a Ferrari. It became about the system, about the daily humiliation of women like Ruth. Donations poured in. A crowdfunding campaign raised thousands within hours. Ordinary people, mothers, nurses, waiters, all touched by the story of a cleaning lady who dared to challenge the impossible to protect the one she loved. The city was divided, but most began to see her with new eyes. The medical team confirmed Zion survived because she got him there in time. The head doctor declared on TV, if she'd arrived 5 minutes later, he wouldn't have made it. That was the turning point. The cleaning agency that employed Ruth released a statement of support. The school launched an awareness campaign, and suddenly, the invisible woman became a symbol. The brave mother, the unlikely heroine, the cleaning lady who defied the system. Meanwhile, Ruth, still weak, recovered in silence, unaware that outside the world had shifted, and that the millionaire was no longer the same man who once dismissed her. Bradley stood for a long time outside the hospital room door. He didn't go in, just watched through the glass. Ruth was sitting, reading a pamphlet, her hair messy, her face worn, but her posture strong. A woman who had stared down death and won. When she looked up and saw him standing there, she didn't flinch. Just looked at him. No fear, no hate, but no smile either. Bradley stepped back. For the first time, he felt small in her presence, as if something deep inside him knew that this woman had just taught him a lesson money could never buy. The next day, Ruth was discharged. Zion would stay hospitalized a bit longer. They were both moved to a private floor, away from the press. But the journalists didn't stop. They wanted her face, her words, her tears. But Ruth refused interviews. She simply said, "My son is alive." That's enough. One reporter asked if she forgave Bradley Wexler. She answered with a question of her own. Would you forgive someone who only saw you when you became a scandal? That line became a headline, and Bradley said nothing, because he understood. True punishment doesn't come from courtrooms. It comes from conscience, and from knowing you ignored someone's worth for years. Online, videos started surfacing of Ruth cleaning the mansion, photos of her and Zion waiting at bus stops, footage from his old school. People shared stories of her kindness behind the scenes. She gave me food when I was new at the front desk. Ruth took care of my grandma at the hospital with more love than anyone else. Small stories, but real. And that's what rebuilt her image. Because, in the end, what she did wasn't theft. It was a scream, a cry for help no one heard, until the roar of a Ferrari was louder than their prejudice. But the court still had to speak. And Ruth, now recognized nationwide, would have to face the trial with the same strength she showed behind the wheel. The media was preparing for spectacle. The defense attorneys were already mapping out strategies. And the eyes of the entire country turned toward a woman who, until then, had only cleaned the corners of other people's homes. But now she was also cleaning up consciences. And hidden in the margins of the humiliation she'd endured, something even more powerful was being born, a movement. What no one knew was that the most powerful scene was still to come. Montgomery County Courthouse was packed. Journalists elbowed their way through the crowd of curious onlookers, mothers with children and activists holding signs. Ruth Malden entered through the main door with her head held high, wearing a simple blue dress, but with the dignity of someone who carried a cause. Beside her, Zion walked slowly, still recovering, but standing tall like his mother. The room fell silent, and for the first time, she wasn't the invisible cleaning lady. She was the woman at the center of it all. The woman who challenged a millionaire, a system, and an entire narrative without ever meaning to become a symbol. The judge was a graying man with deep-set eyes and a tired expression. He looked at Ruth with neutrality, but there was a flicker of respect in his gaze. When the prosecution laid out the charges, it was blunt: theft of a high-value vehicle. But when the defense began presenting the footage, the audio, the medical reports, everything changed. Ruth, kneeling, crying. Zion, hanging between life and death. The key left on the seat. A broken system. Neglect from the security team. Absence from the employers. The prosecutor swallowed hard. The courtroom got emotional. The judge took a deep breath. And suddenly, the word theft started to sound absurd. Ruth was called to testify. She walked to the stand like she was crossing a minefield. The judge asked if she had anything to say. Her voice didn't shake. "I made a mistake, but I made it out of love. And if love is a crime, then I plead guilty with peace in my heart." The room went silent. A woman in the back cried. A reporter lowered his camera. And Bradley Wexler, sitting in the front row, looked down. That statement carried everything. The humiliation she endured, the secret she had to carry for years, and the lesson she taught everyone. Not with noise, but with presence. The verdict came after 3 hours of deliberation. The judge stood, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Ms. Malden broke the law, but performed a miracle." The handcuffs she still wore were removed immediately. The room erupted in applause. Ruth hugged Zion tightly. Her tears were of relief, but also of release. Not just physical freedom. It was emotional freedom from decades of being treated as less. As if her story, her pain, her effort had no worth. But in that moment, she realized, justice may be blind, but it isn't deaf. And finally, someone had listened. Days later, something unexpected happened. Bradley Wexler appeared on national television, apologizing, admitting to his neglect, his prejudice, his lack of empathy. He announced the creation of the Ruth Malden Fund, aimed at supporting single mothers in crisis. Many said it was PR, damage control, just for image. But Ruth didn't comment. She simply said, if it helps other women, then it was worth it. And once again, she delivered a lesson without raising her voice. Because some people teach with words and others teach by simply living. Ruth was one of those. She turned down book deals, reality shows, and sensationalist talk shows. Instead, she chose to walk through public schools, talking to young people, sharing her story without filters, without forced heroism. She simply said, "I was just a mom, and moms do what they have to do." She opened a small community center in her own neighborhood, offering emotional support, tutoring, and open discussion circles. Zion, little by little, became a symbol too. The child who survived, who taught people about love without saying a single word. Together, they built something greater than fame. They built respect. Ruth walked the streets of Clearwood as someone new. People greeted her, applauded her, admired her, but she never gave up her simplicity. She still wore the same clothes, still made coffee in her old French press, still sat on the curb with Zion to watch the sunset. The only difference now was that no one ignored her anymore. And when people asked how she had the courage to face it all, she always answered. It wasn't courage, it was love, and love is the only engine that never fails. That quote was printed on murals, t-shirts, and coffee mugs. But deep down, all she wanted was to live in peace. One afternoon, while tidying up the community center, a 12-year-old student walked up and asked, "Miss Ruth, do you regret it?" She smiled, gently brushed the girl's hair aside, and replied, "Regret comes when we choose ego. But when you choose to save a life, there's no guilt to carry." And in that simple moment, a new generation learned something no schoolbook could ever teach. The value of a woman who dared to break the cycle of humiliation with the strength of a hidden truth, being a mother, a warrior, invisible, and yet irreplaceable. Now tell me, how many stories do you know where the cleaning lady is the main character? How many times has the world stopped to listen to someone who scrubs the forgotten corners of society? Ruth Malden wasn't the exception. She was the mirror, a reflection of so many others you may know, or may be. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Let's spread this example of courage, because every Ruth who stays silent needs someone to help her be heard.